My daddy is a hero. He helps me grow up strong. He helped me snuggle too.
This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen.
No kisses.
Frederick, Colorado sits about 30 miles north of Denver, in the kind of stretch of land where new subdivisions are still eating up old farmland, one cul-de-sac at a time. Is the sort of place people move to specifically because nothing happens there. On a street called Saratoga Trail, in a 5-bedroom house they'd bought 5 years earlier, lived a family that looked, from a phone screen and from the sidewalk, exactly like what everyone else on that street was chasing. A husband with a steady oil industry job, a wife who'd built her own business from her kitchen table, 2 little girls, a 3rd child on the way. At 1:48 in the morning on August 13th, 2018, a neighbor's security camera recorded that wife arriving home from a business trip, dropped off by a friend. She would never leave that house alive again. What makes this case different from most isn't the mystery of who did it. You may already know. The tension here is something else. For 4 days, one man stood in front of cameras, police, and his own parents, and tried to make a lie survive contact with the truth.
She came home from the airport at 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here. About 12:10 in that afternoon, her friend Nichol showed up at the door. I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, but she never got back to me, but she wasn't getting back to any of her people as well.
What's remarkable is exactly how long he almost pulled it off, and what it finally cost him to keep it going. This is the Chris Watts case. Chris Watts and Shanann were both from North Carolina. He from Spring Lake, she from Aberdeen. And they met in 2010 through a mutual connection on Facebook. Shanann had lived with lupus for years, and friends later said Chris was drawn to how relentlessly she refused to let it define her. They married in November of 2012. Looking back, people close to the family would eventually realize the warning signs were never really hidden. They'd simply been accumulating quietly for years in places nobody was looking. A bankruptcy filing in 2015. A husband who almost never spoke about what he was feeling. A marriage that ran increasingly on one person's effort. Then Shanann found Thrive, a health and wellness line sold through a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle, and she turned out to be extraordinarily good at it. Good enough that by 2018, her side income was rivaling her husband's salary. She documented almost everything. The girls in matching outfits, posts about faith and resilience, milestones, vacations. To thousands of followers, this wasn't just a family anymore. It was a brand people had opinions about. Chris barely posted at all. That single habit, saying nothing, agreeing to everything, absorbing pressure rather than voicing it, turns out to be one of the most important threads in this entire case. Because in May of 2018, a new employee joined the safety team at Anadarko Petroleum. Her name was Nichol Kessinger, and the earliest record of Chris and Kessinger's relationship, company emails, still sitting on Anadarko's servers, later pulled into the DA's own document release, shows something almost mundane at first. Kessinger emailing the group about a login issue. Chris not even replying to all. A short thank you note from her a week later for something small he'd helped with. Closing almost sweetly with a line about how underrated honesty was in the modern workplace. Chris wrote back that he was a straightforward guy, that lying just complicated things. He called her stunning, an amazing person. Everything about that exchange reads like 2 coworkers being friendly. It would turn out to be the opening lines of the biggest lie either of them would ever tell.
He's always been such a civil, gentle man to me.
Kessinger, by her own account to investigators, wasn't looking to get involved with a married man. In one of those same early June emails, she told Chris directly that she was looking for someone to build a life with. Something similar, she wrote, to what he already had with his wife and daughters. Out of respect for herself and his family, she said they should keep things at work. By July, they weren't. Chris told her he was separated, that he didn't wear his wedding ring at the office, that he was living in the basement of his own house while he and Shanann finalized a divorce and got ready to sell it. None of that was true. Shanann didn't know any of it was happening, but Kessinger believed it completely. She'd later tell investigators she never saw a single red flag in how Chris spoke about his family.
He's always been pretty calm and level-headed when he talks about the differences between him and his wife.
Because as far as she knew, that family was already over. Shanann, 3 states away in North Carolina, finishing a family vacation in late July, had no idea any of this existed. She sent Chris a long, aching text about how distant he'd become, how he hadn't shown, in weeks apart, that he missed her at all. Chris gave her vague, non-committal replies. On August 9th, Shanann left for a business trip to Arizona. Before she left, she texted a friend that she and Chris had just had their best talk yet about the marriage, and even wrote him a handwritten letter. Whatever she believed was happening between them, she believed it was getting better. She had no way of knowing that 2 days later, with her out of state, Chris told a babysitter he was going to a baseball game with co-workers, and went to a bar with Kessinger instead. By then, Chris was already discussing what an apartment for himself and the girls might look like once the divorce he'd invented was finalized. Kessinger, for her part, spent hours that same week online looking at wedding dresses. Shanann flew home 2 days later with 15 weeks left in her pregnancy and a letter already written for a husband who had, by then, been living an entirely different life for months. At 1:48 a.m. on August 13th, a neighbor's security camera recorded Shanann Watts arriving, driven by her friend and Thrive colleague Nichol Atkinson. Chris was already there with the girls, according to what Chris would eventually admit. He woke Shanann as he was getting ready for work, wanting to talk about the marriage, about the future. That conversation, whatever was actually said in it, ended with Shanann dead. Investigators would later place the murders in the window between roughly 4 and 5 a.m. At 5:27 a.m., that same neighbor's camera recorded Chris backing his Anadarko work truck into the garage. The neighbor would later describe him in that footage as simply not acting right. Here's where the timeline stops being circumstantial and starts being damning. At 6:53 a.m., GPS data from Chris's company vehicle placed him at Survey 319, an isolated, restricted access Anadarko oil site, the kind of place you only have reason to be if you work there. He stayed for more than 2 hours. Then, at 8:26 a.m., Chris called the girls' school, Primrose, to withdraw them from enrollment. 2 minutes later, at 8:28 a.m., he called his realtor to talk about selling the family home. 2 phone calls, 4 minutes apart, from a man who would spend the next 48 hours insisting he had no idea where his family had gone.
If they're not safe right now, that's what's tearing me apart. If they are safe, they're coming back. But if they're not, this has got to stop. Somebody has to come forward.
Nichol Atkinson had a bad feeling before anyone else did. Shanann had missed a scheduled prenatal appointment that morning. She wasn't answering texts. And Shanann, a woman who posted constantly, who never went anywhere without her lupus medication, had gone completely silent. At around 12:10 p.m., Atkinson drove to the house. She knocked. She rang the doorbell. Nothing. She called Chris at work. He came home and let her, and soon after, a Frederick police officer walk through the house during a welfare check. Inside, Shanann's car in the garage, her purse with her phone, her keys and her lupus medication, sitting untouched, her wedding rings on the bed. Atkinson called it in as a missing persons report at approximately 1:40 p.m. A neighbor, Nathan Trinastich, offered his home security footage almost immediately, footage installed for entirely ordinary reasons. That was about to become the backbone of the entire case. That footage showed only one person leaving the house that morning, and in less than 24 hours, that same man would stand on his own front lawn and lie to the entire country about it, live on camera. On August 14th, with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation issuing an endangered missing alert and reporters already camped outside, Chris agreed to speak to Denver's ABC affiliate on his own front lawn.
My kids are my life. I miss telling them, hey, you got to eat that or you're not going to get your dessert, and just I miss that. I miss them, cuddle up on their couches. It was tearing me apart last night. I want everybody to just come home. Wherever they're at, come home.
He asked Shanann and the girls to come home, if they were out there. He described Shanann telling him, vaguely, that she was taking the kids to a friend's house, an account that didn't match what he'd told police, and that would keep shifting over the next 24 hours. Millions of people would eventually watch that clip, and the reaction, then and now, is almost universal. No cracking voice, no real panic, a man reciting concern rather than feeling it. Investigators noticed the same thing, and the next morning they had a new way to test exactly how much of it was performance. By August 15th, the FBI had joined the search, and Chris agreed to come in for what he was told was a polygraph examination. He failed it. Special Agent Tammy Lee ran the post-polygraph interview, and she didn't come in swinging. She let Chris repeat the story he'd already told twice, the vague account of Shanann leaving with the girls. Then calmly, she told him something close to this, that only one person in the room currently knew the truth, but that was about to change. What followed wasn't a single collapse, it was an erosion. Small concession after small concession, each one slightly less deniable than the last, because Lee kept anchoring him back to one unmovable fact, the neighbor's footage and a timeline with no room left in it for the story he was telling. Watch the footage closely and you can track it almost physically. The long pauses get longer, the eye contact gets shorter, the answers get vaguer, exactly where they used to be specific. Eventually, Chris asked to speak to his father, Ronnie, who'd flown in from North Carolina.
Lost it and took her. No, just this is rage. And well, now about her.
In that conversation, captured on the same recording, Chris admitted to his father that he had killed Shanann. What he said next was still a lie.
So she started her begins. One, she smelled it. Our token. I didn't hear anything. When I was downstairs, they came back up and they were gone.
Chris claimed he'd woken to find Bella already dead, and that he'd walked in on Shanann strangling Celeste, and that he'd strangled Shanann himself only in a sudden, horrified rage. A wife who murdered her own children, a husband who snapped. It was, for a few hours, a story his own parents desperately wanted to believe. Investigators later said Chris himself would admit the idea wasn't even his, that it had been floated to him during questioning, and he'd simply gone with it, because it was the version of himself he could still live with saying out loud. It would turn out to be false in almost every detail, but investigators didn't need the whole truth yet. They just needed a location, and Chris was about to give them one. Chris marked the site on a photograph of the oil field, and investigators moved out to Survey 319 that same night. Shanann's body was recovered from a shallow grave on the property. Bella and Celeste were found separately, inside two different crude oil storage tanks, each with an opening only 8 inches wide. Chris was arrested that night. On August 21st, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The affair with Nichol Kessinger, once investigators laid out the full timeline, was the through line the entire case turned on. She was never charged. Investigators confirmed she had no knowledge of the murders and cooperated fully once the arrest became public. Police records note that once she learned Shanann had been pregnant, Kessinger deleted every call and text tied to Chris from her phone. Investigators recovered the records anyway. For 7 more months, the official story stayed exactly where Chris had left it. A rage killing, provoked by a wife the record would later prove had done nothing at all. In February of 2019, 3 investigators from the FBI, the CBI, and Frederick PD sat down with Chris again at the Wisconsin prison where he was now being held. This interview lasted 5.5 hours, and it corrected the lie he told his father.
The girls are still in the truck.
Okay.
Did they ask you what you were doing, taking mommy out, or?
Yeah, I don't remember what I told them, but they did ask that.
What they say specifically?
It was more like, what are you doing to mommy?
And then the girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There had been no scene of Shanann strangling their daughters. There had been no rage-fueled rescue. Chris told investigators he had strangled Shanann himself in their bedroom, and that both girls were still alive during the drive to the oil site afterward.
You mentioned Bella was first. Cece was first, okay. Where exactly was she when it happened?
In the backseat.
Okay. Was she just right next to Bella?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So once again, was it a hand over her face? Was it?
There was a blanket.
Okay. Did she struggle at all?
I don't think so, but I was blocking her face and my hand was right here.
Oh, okay.
But ask him, in that same interview, whether he'd planned it. And Chris gave investigators an answer that's almost stranger than a confession of premeditation would have been.
So that soft voice she always had.
What exactly did she say?
She said exactly the same thing that happened to me in CC. And then I said, I don't remember what I said. I don't know if I just said yes, like a horrible person, or if I just put that blanket over her too and did the same thing.
Same blanket, same way?
Mm-hmm. She said, no, Daddy. That's the last thing she said.
He described it as something that arrived that morning. fully formed, and that he had no control over. Words to that effect are in the interview record itself. That's the official account. It is not, however, the only account Chris has given. In separate letters he later wrote from prison to an outside correspondent, a published non-official source, worth flagging clearly every time it comes up. Chris described something that directly contradicts what he told investigators. Weeks of turning the idea over in his mind, and a specific chilling awareness the night before the murders that he already knew what was coming and didn't stop it. Both of those can't be fully true at once. A compulsion he had no control over, and a decision he says he'd been sitting with for weeks, are two different men describing two different crimes. What's actually verifiable is narrower than either version. He killed his family. He lied about it first to a detective, then to his own father, and even once the official confession corrected the lie, his own later account of his own state of mind still doesn't square with what he told the people investigating him, which is really the whole shape of this case in miniature. Even when Chris Watts finally stops lying about what he did, he still can't seem to tell the same story twice about why. On November 6th, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. At Shanann's family's request, prosecutors did not pursue the death penalty. The Rzuceks wanted the case resolved without a trial that would force them to sit through months of testimony about how their daughter and granddaughters died.
This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen.
At sentencing on November 19th, Judge Marcelo Kopkow called it one of the most inhumane crimes he'd ever handled. Shanann's father, Frank Rzucek, addressed his former son-in-law directly, telling him he could no longer even look at him. Kopkow handed down 5 life sentences without parole, 3 of them consecutive, plus 84 additional years across the pregnancy termination and body tampering counts, structured so that no single successful appeal on any one count could ever free him. Watts was moved out of Colorado for his own safety and remains at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, a maximum security facility that used to be a state hospital for the criminally insane. The case didn't end at sentencing, though the public record of it mostly did. A year later, in November 2019, the Rzuceks won a civil wrongful death judgment. $1 million for each of the 3 deaths. $3 million more for what the court documents describe as the ongoing grief, anger, and loneliness the murders had caused them. Watts never contested a cent of it. His own filing agreed the losses were exactly what the family said they were. Everyone involved understood the money would likely never actually change hands from a man serving 5 life sentences. The judgment was less about collection than about making sure he could never profit from what he'd done, in a book deal or otherwise. Nichol Kessinger, never charged with anything, gave one interview to the Denver Post in the weeks after the arrest, then went quiet. After a Netflix documentary revisited the case in 2020, she petitioned a Colorado court to legally change her name and largely disappeared from public view, citing ongoing threats. That hasn't stopped a wave of amateur reopen the case theories that keep resurfacing online. Petitions, videos, claims of hidden accomplices, or new digital forensics. None of it has moved anywhere for the simplest reason there is. Chris Watts pleaded guilty. There was no trial, which means there's no appeal to file. The physical evidence, the GPS data, the neighbor's security footage, his own confession leading investigators directly to the bodies, was never actually in dispute. None of that is where this story actually ends, though. Here's the thing that makes the Chris Watts case different from almost every other true crime story. There was never a whodunit. What there was instead was a demonstration of exactly how long a lie can survive once it's already lost. Told to a dispatcher, then to a camera crew, then to a detective, then, hardest of all, to his own father. And even after that lie broke, there was a second, murkier one underneath it. Not the tidy premeditation story. That's contested, and Chris's own accounts of it don't even agree with each other. Just a man who, 7 months later, still couldn't give investigators, or himself, in the separate letters he wrote afterward, a single, consistent explanation of his own mind. Each version of the story bought him a little more time. Each one demanded a little more performance, and each one collapsed the moment it touched something real. A doorbell camera, nobody installed for him, a school enrollment record, a father's face in an interrogation room, asking his son to just tell the truth. Watch the footage again with that in mind, and it stops being a story about a missing family. It becomes a study in exactly how far a calm voice and a rehearsed sentence can carry someone, and exactly where they run out of road. Shanann's family has spent the years since turning that story into advocacy instead of silence. That, in the end, is the only ending here that was ever really theirs to write. If you want to see that same mechanic, a calm liar undone by something as ordinary as a security camera, play out in a case where the ending wasn't already public knowledge going in, go watch our Anthony McLean episode next. It's the same investigative pattern from the other side of the badge.